Elon Musk has been blunt about this, and I'm starting where he starts because the simplest external check matters most. He didn't obsess over the cinematography. He paid less attention to the footage itself and more to the silence that came afterward. That is a clue about incentives and verification, not vibes. If the world is watching, any grand claim has to survive outside scrutiny. The core issue was never about fuzzy footage or lighting illusions. It was about the hard data, instruments, telemetry, and whether the story could withstand outside scrutiny. Once the claim became testable, the real question was simple. Could anyone beyond NASA catch a fraud as it unfolded? And in that arena where every signal was open to interception, any attempt to fake it would be exposed instantly by foreign antennas. From day one, that outside monitoring made Apollo function like a public audit. But the only question that matters, and in that kind of adversarial theater, if you fake it, adversaries with antennas expose you. That is why from the very beginning, rival tracking turned Apollo into a public audit. Now we have to talk about the risk landscape, because that is where the truth gets pressure tested. Elon Musk famously said that this argument is the reason why he believes in the moon landing. But is this that simple? In a world where your rival can blast your reputation, you don't bet everything on silence. Cold War stakes were brutal, humiliation was a competitive sport, and every misstep was an opening. Independent observatories and foreign stations weren't politely applauding, they were measuring, logging, and comparing. When your opponents can reconstruct your trajectory and signal timing, fakery isn't just unethical, it is operationally suicidal. That is the leverage point, the very nature of open RF emissions and predictable orbital mechanics tied the hands of any would-be hoaxer. And that's exactly how outside observers turned Apollo into a public audit. And with that framing, the question then becomes, what proof actually supports the certainty behind his stance? Let's build the audit trail from the first step. Before debating camera quirks, remember the openness of Apollo's transmissions. This wasn't cinema neatly spooled from a single studio feed. The moon cameras didn't send a clean TV picture straight to people's homes. They used a slow scan signal that had to be converted on Earth, which made the footage look worse, but also created several checkpoints where outsiders could measure timing, frequencies, and delays. Even during Armstrong's first step, the signal passed through tracking stations and conversion equipment before it hit living room TVs, leaving behind logs and timestamps that anyone outside of NASA could compare and verify. The plumbing wasn't a bug, it was the audit surface, and that's another reason rival tracking turned Apollo into a public audit. Now for the math. Because, well, numbers are stubborn. Carrier shifts, Doppler curves, and delay lines match celestial mechanics that anyone with the right gear could verify. If the source had been a terrestrial transmitter, the Doppler profile wouldn't have painted a lunar trajectory that synchronized with orbital predictions and handoffs across continents. Even the visuals reflect pipeline realities. The broadcast, if you remember, was first projected onto a screen at NASA and then refilmed for broadcast, which explains the softer look without implying artifacts. Start with the ground network that corroborated one another in real time, Honeysuckle Creek, Goldstone, Parkes, plus British and European partners, each logging the same physics. They handed off, compared, and logged consistent results. That means redundancy, parallel views, and cross-checks that don't rely on trust, but on consistency. Across oceans, antennas recorded parallel measurements lining up on timestamps, carrier behavior, and signal strength. This is what auditing looks like in engineering, independent systems converging on the same answer. The redundancies are the point, and those redundancies are precisely why rival tracking turned Apollo into a public audit. So let's sweep through the myths but keep the audit frame. Stars and photos? Short exposures for blinding daylight terrain erase faint pinpoints. Basic photography. The broadcasts look janky. Well, that's the scan conversion pipeline, not evidence of a set. To some eyes, the fabric seems to wave, as if breeze were pushing it. It doesn't. The motion was introduced by setup, and slowly in a vacuum, because space is a vacuum with no air to slow things down, it then takes time for disturbances to die out. And crucially, these visuals don't stand alone. They sit beside third-party station logs and telemetry. Zooming out, a pattern emerges. Stack the incentives, the radio audits, the station cross-checks, the lab-verified samples, and the simple physics, and you get a story that repeats the same conclusion from different angles. That is the power of independent convergence. You don't need trust, you need agreement among instruments. When the claim survives every adversarial look, it doesn't feel like hand-waving. It feels like the way you'd audit any grand claim. And that is the final reason rival tracking turned Apollo into a public audit. Now here's the cultural coda. The moon landing continues to spark curiosity, controversy, and heated discussion more than 50 years later, which says as much about us as it does about the mission. We crave story over system diagrams, but the diagrams are where truth keeps its ledger. Even so, the legacy isn't a museum piece, it's a method. The open sky, the predictable math, and the willingness to let opponents measure you in public. Those are the rules that made the difference. That is the ethos behind a real-time public audit, and it is why Apollo became a public audit under global scrutiny. Now let's get concrete about that real-time public audit. Imagine a hidden terrestrial transmitter trying to mimic a lunar signal during a translunar coast. The predicted Doppler for a spacecraft follows a smooth, clockable curve driven by changing geometry. A fixed or aircraft-borne source cannot match both the frequency slope and the time of flight delays to multiple, widely separated stations at once. The instant you force alignment for one dish, you break it for another. Add ranging tones, bit timing on telemetry frames, and pre-planned handover schedules tied to the Earth's rotation, each is a separate fuse ready to blow on a fake. Layer them together, and you see why rival tracking turned Apollo into a public audit. Now, consider the unglamorous paperwork. Logs, calibration files, observation sheets. Independent stations document equipment temperature, LNA gain, local oscillator drift, and weather. Those notes explain why a signal sagged here or a noise figure improved there, so future reviewers can replicate the analysis. That archival rigor lets us rerun the math decades later and reach the same outcome. Meanwhile, in the lab, the thin rims of impact melt glass encasing vesicles of trapped volatiles align with known lunar regolith processes, just as the retroreflector returns modulate with libration and Earth-Moon geometry. Physical, optical, and RF domains cross-validate each other, which is the textbook definition of why rival tracking turned Apollo into a public audit. The legacy isn't just that the mission happened, it's that the method scaled. SpaceX booster landings, deep space flybys, even occultations of distant stars. Engineers now design public telemetry windows, publish predicted tracking curves, and invite the world to watch. That is the future-proof lesson. Don't ask people to believe, give them instruments and predictions they can check. When claims are architected for outside verification, narratives become optional. That is how you win in a skeptical era. Not with pronouncements, but with convergence. The more eyes, the better the truth gets. And on that principle, and its Cold War origin story, rival tracking turned Apollo into a public audit.